March 22, 1945. In a makeshift processing center outside newly liberated Manila, a young Filipina woman named Maria Santos sat at a wooden table, both hands wrapped around a metal cup that radiated warmth into her palms. Steam rose from the cup's dark surface, carrying an aroma she had not encountered in 3 years, the rich, bitter-sweet scent of real coffee. An American Red Cross worker had placed it before her moments earlier with a gentle instruction: "Drink slowly. Your stomach needs time." Maria raised the cup to her lips with trembling hands. The weight of it strange after years of holding nothing but tin cans for water and crude bowls for watery rice. The first sip struck her tongue like a revelation. It was hot, genuinely hot, not lukewarm. It was strong, almost aggressive in its boldness. It was sweet, with real sugar dissolved into it. A taste memory from childhood that seemed to belong to someone else's life. And it was abundant. The American had poured the cup full, not measured out in careful sips, not rationed or reserved or controlled. Just given, freely, as if coffee were as common as air. Maria's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the coffee's heat. She had survived 3 years in Japanese civilian internment camps, Santo Tomas, then a smaller facility outside the city, where food was measured in ounces, where a spoonful of rice could mean the difference between strength and collapse, where abundance was a concept that belonged to the dead past. The taste of American coffee, rich and real and freely given, represented something beyond mere nourishment. It represented the return of a world where things could be plentiful, where generosity was possible, where the future might contain something other than scarcity and suffering. Around her, hundreds of other female prisoners, Filipinas, Americans, British, Dutch, sat with their own cups, drinking slowly as instructed, many weeping as they drank, each processing in her own way the sensory proof that captivity had ended and abundance had returned. The historical context that made this moment so profound began, not in the liberation, but in the years of deprivation that preceded it. When Japanese forces had conquered the Philippines in early 1942, they had interned thousands of enemy civilians, primarily Americans and Europeans who had been residents, missionaries, businesspeople, teachers, nurses. These internees, along with captured Allied military nurses and Filipino civilians deemed security risks, were concentrated in camps where Japanese military authorities provided minimal resources and often deliberately withheld supplies as policy. Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Manila, the largest such facility, held over 4,000 civilians at its peak, crammed into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. The Japanese provided a daily ration that amounted to approximately 1,000 calories per person by 1944, roughly half what an adult needs for basic survival. Internees supplemented this through whatever means they could: smuggling, camp gardens, occasionally purchasing food from Filipino civilians at inflated prices, but malnutrition became universal. Women suffered particularly acutely, their bodies requiring specific nutrients that the rice and vegetable diet could not provide. Menstruation stopped for most women within months as their bodies shut down non-essential functions. Teeth loosened from scurvy, hair fell out, skin developed sores that would not heal. The psychological impact of sustained hunger was as devastating as the physical. The constant preoccupation with food, the dreams of meals from the past, the way conversations inevitably returned to recipes and restaurants and foods that seemed impossibly distant. The women interned in Japanese camps had expected hardship when war came to the Philippines, but they had not anticipated the systematic deprivation that became daily reality. Most were educated, middle-class individuals who had known comfortable lives. They expected prisoner treatment in line with Geneva Convention standards, perhaps uncomfortable but fundamentally humane. What they experienced instead was calculated scarcity, a policy of providing just enough food to keep prisoners alive, but not enough to maintain health. combined with indifference to suffering that seemed to characterize Japanese military administration of civilian internees. The contrast between expectation and experience created psychological trauma that would persist long after physical recovery. Women who had been nurses found themselves unable to treat patients because medical supplies were denied. Teachers organized classes for children, but watched students grow weak and listless from hunger. Mothers rationed their own portions to feed children, accepting starvation as the price of their children's survival. The camps developed internal economies where cigarettes, clothing, and eventually any possession became tradable for food. Dignity eroded along with health. Women wore clothing patched and repatched until it fell apart, their bodies increasingly visible through fabric too worn to provide modesty. The Japanese provided no replacements, no supplies beyond minimal food, as if the internees were problems to be contained, rather than human beings with needs. The symbolic object that would come to represent everything the women had lost and would rediscover through liberation was not the coffee itself, but the cup, the metal canteen cup, sturdy and plain, that American forces used as standard field equipment and distributed freely to liberated prisoners. These cups were mass-produced items, utterly unremarkable in American military supply systems, issued by the tens of thousands. To women who had eaten from tin cans or carved wooden bowls, who had drunk from whatever containers they could fashion or salvage, the American canteen cup was a marvel of abundance. It was purpose-built, designed specifically for drinking. It was durable, made to last. It was clean, distributed freshly washed. And it was given without expectation of return, handed to prisoners with the implicit message that there were more where that came from. That American supply systems treated even humble items like drinking cups as abundant enough to distribute freely. The cup became a talisman for many women, something they kept after liberation as physical proof that they had survived to reach a world where things could be abundant again. When Maria Santos held that cup, feeling its weight and warmth, the object itself carried meaning beyond its contents. It was evidence of systems that functioned, of societies that produced enough to give things away, of a future that might include security rather than perpetual scarcity. The transformation in perception began with that first sip, but deepened as the full scope of American logistics revealed itself in the days following liberation. The coffee was not a one-time gift, but standard, distributed 3 times daily with sugar and condensed milk available for those who wanted it. Meals arrived on schedules kept with military precision. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, each with portions that seemed impossibly large to stomachs shrunken by years of inadequate food. The American field rations themselves were revelations. K rations and C rations, which American soldiers complained about as monotonous and unappetizing, contained more food than many internees had eaten in a day during the final months of captivity. The rations included items that seemed almost fantastical: chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum, instant coffee, canned meat, crackers, hard candy. Each component was packaged, protected, designed to survive shipment across oceans. The abundance was systematic, not exceptional. American medical personnel explained that the women would need to increase food intake gradually to avoid refeeding syndrome, a dangerous condition where malnourished bodies could not process sudden abundance. But the medical staff also made clear that food was not scarce, that restrictions were medical rather than supply-driven, that there was enough and more than enough for everyone. The evidence of American logistical capability appeared in countless details that accumulated into overwhelming proof of systematic difference between societies. The medical examinations conducted on liberated prisoners used equipment that was clean, modern, plentiful. Doctors had medicines that Japanese camp physicians had lacked: antibiotics, vitamins, painkillers, treatments for tropical diseases that had gone untreated for years. Clothing arrived within days, not cast-offs or charity items, but new military-issue clothing modified for civilian use, distributed based on size and need rather than bartered or bought. Soap, toothbrushes, sanitary supplies for women, all the small necessities of maintaining dignity and health that had been absent for years appeared as if materialized from air, distributed freely by Red Cross workers and military supply personnel, who treated these items as obvious necessities rather than luxuries. Women who had not had proper menstrual supplies for years, who had used rags washed and rewashed until they fell apart, received packages of sanitary napkins manufactured specifically for the purpose, abundant enough that they did not need to be hoarded or saved. The psychological impact of this abundance was profound. It represented not just material wealth, but social organization, a civilization that considered women's specific needs important enough to manufacture and distribute specialized products, that treated dignity and comfort as rights rather than privileges. The sound that characterized the liberation camps was not celebration or chaos, but something more subtle and more meaningful. The sound of normal conversation. Women talked while drinking coffee, their voices gradually recovering strength and animation. They discussed not just survival, but future plans, where they would go, what they would do, how they would rebuild lives. The conversations themselves were evidence of transformation. In the internment camps, talk had circled endlessly around food, around memories of meals, around fantasies of abundance. Now, drinking actual coffee and eating actual meals, women could discuss other things, could imagine futures beyond mere survival. The American personnel encouraged this, treated the women as people with agency and plans rather than victims requiring only charity. Red Cross workers asked about family, about skills and education, about plans for repatriation or settlement. The assumption embedded in these conversations was that the women had futures worth planning, that they would recover health and rebuild lives, that the world they were returning to had room for their ambitions and contributions. This assumption, as much as the material abundance, represented philosophical difference between captivity and liberation. The taste of American coffee became a recurring symbol in the accounts of female prisoners from across the Pacific Theater, not just in the Philippines but in Singapore, Hong Kong, Java, wherever Japanese forces had interned civilian women. Each liberation followed similar patterns: the initial distribution of food and drink, the medical examinations, the gradual reintroduction to abundance. And in many accounts, coffee appeared as the sensory marker of freedom, the taste that represented return to normality. This was partly because coffee had specific associations with Western civilian life, with morning routines and social gatherings, with normalcy rather than survival. But it was also because coffee, properly made with sugar and milk, represented a kind of abundance that was not merely about calories, but about pleasure, about consuming something for taste and comfort, rather than desperate necessity. The American forces who distributed that coffee did so casually, as routine, not understanding initially how profound the experience was for recipients. To American soldiers, coffee was standard, unremarkable, something they complained about when it was not hot enough or strong enough. To women emerging from years of deprivation, that same coffee was proof that the world they remembered, where things could be, plentiful and pleasures could be, simple and daily life did not revolve around desperate. Scarcity still existed and could be returned to. The systematics. Difference between Japanese and American approaches to prisoners revealed itself not just in supplies but in attitudes and procedures. Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on discipline and hierarchy and its contempt for surrender, had treated civilian internees as burdens at best, as enemies deserving of suffering at worst. Supplies were withheld partly from necessity. Japan's own supply lines were strained, but also from policy, from belief that enemy civilians deserved minimal consideration and that comfort was weakness. American military culture, informed by different values and backed by vast logistical capacity, treated prisoners as individuals deserving of care and respect. This was not merely humanitarian sentiment, but systematic policy embedded in procedures and training. American forces liberating camps arrived with supplies specifically allocated for prisoners. Medical equipment, food, clothing, all prepositioned based on intelligence estimates of how many people would need assistance. The planning itself represented philosophical stance that caring for liberated prisoners was military responsibility, the resources should be allocated accordingly, that the measure of civilization was how it treated those in need, rather than merely how effectively it destroyed enemies. The coffee distributed to Maria Santos and thousands of other women was not charity spontaneously offered, but outcome of planning, of supply chains that had anticipated need and delivered accordingly, of a society that treated humanitarian obligation as systematically as military necessity. By April 1945, as American forces consolidated control of Manila and established more permanent facilities for displaced civilians, the initial liberation camps gave way to repatriation processing centers where women awaited transport home or to new settlements. The coffee continued to flow 3 times daily, reliably. But now it was accompanied by other markers of returning normality. Newspapers, letters from home for those whose families could be located, even occasional entertainment provided by military bands or USO performers. The women themselves began to look different, gaining weight, their health visibly improving, their clothing clean and adequate, their faces showing something beyond mere survival. The transformation was physical but also psychological. Women who had moved through internment camps with the cautiousness of people who owned nothing and expected nothing began to show agency and confidence again. They made plans, asked questions about destinations and procedures, organized themselves into groups for mutual support during repatriation. The coffee that had initially been symbol of abundance became simply coffee again, appreciated but no longer miraculous, as normality reasserted itself. This transition, from finding coffee miraculous to finding it ordinary, marked successful completion of liberation's psychological work. The abundance had been internalized. The scarcity mindset had begun to heal. The future had become imaginable again. The historical evidence of how profoundly the experience of liberation shaped these women appears in testimonies, memoirs, and oral histories collected in subsequent decades. Many describe the taste of that first cup of American coffee with remarkable specificity, remembering details of temperature and sweetness and context that other memories from the period could not match. The coffee had been a pivot point, a sensory marker that divided before from after, captivity from freedom, scarcity from abundance. Some women reported that for years afterward, the smell of coffee would trigger emotions they could not fully articulate, a complex mixture of relief and grief and gratitude. Others noted that they could never quite take abundance for granted again, that even decades later in comfortable circumstances, they would feel a flutter of anxiety when food supplies ran low, or would hoard small items in ways that family members found inexplicable. The trauma of sustained deprivation had left marks that liberation's abundance could not immediately erase. But the coffee itself, and everything it represented about American logistical capacity and humanitarian values, had also left marks, memories of being treated with dignity when most vulnerable, of receiving generosity without expectation of return, of witnessing a kind of abundance that was not hoarded but shared, that existed to be distributed rather than guarded. The epilogue of the coffee story extended far beyond individual liberation experiences to questions of civilization and values that the war had forced into stark relief. The women who drank that first cup of American coffee had survived one system and been rescued by another, and the contrast between systems could not have been clearer. Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on discipline and sacrifice and its contempt for weakness, had created camps where civilians were treated as problems, where suffering was policy. where abundance was withheld even when available because comfort was seen as corrupting. American military culture, informed by democratic values and sustained by industrial abundance, had created liberation systems where caring for civilians was responsibility, where suffering was problem requiring solution, where abundance was distributed freely because sharing was considered both moral obligation and strategic wisdom. The coffee, hot, sweet, freely given, symbolized these differences more eloquently than any propaganda could. It represented a society wealthy enough that its soldiers drank coffee daily, organizational systems efficient enough to deliver coffee across oceans, and values that assumed even prisoners and refugees deserved basic comforts. The contrast between 3 years of Japanese captivity and the first days of American liberation provided women like Maria Santos with experiential understanding of how profoundly societies could differ in their treatment of vulnerable people, in their allocation of resources, in their fundamental assumptions about human worth and dignity. When Maria Santos finally left the Philippines months later, repatriated to family in California she had not seen since before the war, she carried with her a metal canteen cup that an American soldier had told her to keep. It sat in her kitchen for the rest of her life, used for coffee every morning, a ritual that connected present comfort to past deprivation and liberation. The cup bore no inscription, carried no official significance, was merely a mass-produced item from vast American supply systems that had distributed thousands like it. But for Maria, it remained a talisman of transformation, physical evidence of the day when abundance had returned to her world, when the taste of American coffee had announced that survival had become something more, that life might include not just scarcity and endurance, but pleasure and possibility. The cup reminded her that civilization was not abstract, but tangible, not just ideas, but systems that either cared for people or did not, that either treated human dignity as important or did not, that either shared abundance or hoarded it. She had experienced both systems and carried the cup as testimony to the difference. The coffee it held each morning was just coffee, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly as it should be in a world where abundance was normal rather than miraculous. And in that ordinariness lay the deepest transformation of all, the return to a world where simple pleasures were not rationed or restricted or controlled, but were freely available, where a cup of coffee was not a luxury marking special occasion, but a daily comfort that anyone could enjoy, where the taste of freedom was as simple and profound as warmth spreading through cold hands, bitterness cut by sweetness, and the knowledge that there would be another cup tomorrow, and the day after, as many as anyone wanted. Because in the world that had returned with liberation, in the world, American abundance had made visible coffee. Like dignity, like hope, like the future itself, was something that could be shared rather than hoarded, enjoyed rather than merely survived for, a gift given freely because free people in free societies had learned that their greatest strength lay not in withholding, but in giving, not in scarcity, but in abundance, not in the closed fist of control, but in the open hand of generosity that had placed a cup of hot coffee before a starving woman and said simply, "Drink, there is more. There will always be more. You are free now."